Hi, welcome to Fermilab's Earth Day celebration. We're glad to have you here. My name's Kathy Clarkin, and I'm joined by our moderator, Sue Steyer. Sue will be keeping an eye on chat, so if you have any comments or ideas or questions you want to share with the group, please type them into chat. Before we get started, just a little bit about me. I'm an education facilitator at Fermilab, which means I teach students and the public about the science of Fermilab. And before that, I was an environmental chemist and studied the risk of pollution to human health. For Earth Day today, I'm going to tell you how to do some experiments at home or in your classroom to explore the connection between chemistry and nature. I'll also give you a little bit of background before we get started with the experiments. So lots of people think that if something is a chemical, it's unnatural. But guess what? Everything in nature is made of chemicals. I'm going to give you a few examples of chemicals in nature, but first let me quickly point out that all chemicals are made of atoms, and all the different atoms or elements that scientists have discovered are on the periodic table of elements. If you haven't learned about this in school yet, you probably will soon. Some of the atoms or elements that you probably have heard of before are oxygen, iron, and helium, the stuff that makes balloons float. So here are a few examples of chemicals, which are specific combinations of atoms that are found in nature. Water is in every living thing. I bet you already know that the chemical formula for water is H2O. That means that there are 2 hydrogen for every 1 oxygen in a water molecule. Limestone is a kind of rock found in Illinois. Its chemical formula is CaCO3. We call that calcium carbonate. There is 1 calcium and 1 carbon for every 3 atoms of oxygen in calcium carbonate. And one final example of a chemical in nature. The cell walls of plants are made of cellulose. Cell is even part of its name. The chemical formula of cellulose is C6H10O5N with a ratio of 6 carbon to 10 hydrogen to 5 oxygen. The N part means that this part of the molecule repeats over and over again to form a very large compound that we call a polymer. The large size of the cellulose molecule helps give structure to plants. All living and non-living things in nature are made of chemicals. Before we start our experiments, I'm happy to stop here and answer any questions. Is there anything you're curious about or you need some clarification about?
Well, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, so we can just continue to encourage people to put in questions if they have any at any time.
Great, thanks, Sue. Well, experimentation is my favorite part of science, so we'll jump right into our experiments then. So today I'm going to show you 2 experiments you can do at home or in your class that'll better help you understand that connection between chemistry and nature. If you want to do a 3rd experiment, we actually have a video that has another experiment. It's called The Chemistry in Nature. And one of my colleagues here will put that link in our chat so you can check that one out too. So our first experiment is about acids and bases. Have you ever heard the term pH before? It's a scale that scientists use to understand if something is an acid or a base. You may have heard the word acid before, like there's acid in your stomach that helps you digest food, or there's acid in batteries, so you don't want to break them open. On the opposite end of the pH scale are bases. We call these alkaline. And a couple examples are soap and bleach. In between acid and base is neutral. Neutral is pH 7, and below 7 are acids, and above 7 have a pH, above 7 are bases. So it may seem backward, but the more acidic something is, the lower the pH. pH is really important in nature because plants and animals each have a certain range of pHs where they can thrive. For many, this range is generally around that neutral of a pH 7. There are exceptions though. For example, some plants like soil to have a lower or higher pH. Certain pond species can only live in a very narrow range of pHs, while others can tolerate a very wide range. So you can see why when you're trying to understand an ecosystem, what can live there and what makes it healthy, it's important to know how to measure pH. So for our experiment, here is our supply list. You're going to need purple cabbage, scissors, water from your sink, water from nature. You can collect that from a nearby river, pond, lake, or you could put a bucket out and collect some rainwater. Or if we get more snow, you could collect some snow. Clear glass or plastic jars or cups, and other things that you can find around nature or in your house to test, like juice or milk or dirt, things like that. So your first step is to make a pH indicator. Chop up about 1/4 of the purple cabbage and put it in a bowl. Heat up some water in a microwave-safe container. You might want some adult help with that. And then pour the hot water over the cabbage until it's just covered. Leave that sit until it cools down. Then separate the cabbage from the purple liquid, which is your pH indicator, by either carefully pouring the water into a jar or bowl so that the cabbage stays behind, or you can use a colander or a sieve to do that. You can throw away the cabbage, but be sure to save the purple liquid. That's your pH indicator. And by indicator, we mean a chemical that changes color in the presence of an acid or base. Now you can use your pH indicator. You'll want to start by testing an acid, a base, and tap water, which is neutral. This will give you a good idea of the colors that you're going to get with your indicator. So to do this, you put your test chemical in a cup and carefully pour a bit of your pH indicator using a spoon or just pouring it in. As you can see, I've tested an acid vinegar, a base baking soda, and tap water here. This baking soda I mixed with water first. So that gives you kind of an idea of the colors you'll see with acids, bases, and neutral. And here's a indicator scale that you can also use to figure out what the pH is of your test chemical. So now you're going to want to test the water that you collected outdoors. Find out what its pH is, and then try testing water from different sources, like is there a difference between pond water and lake water? Then you can try things from around your house, like egg whites, milk, juices, all sorts of different ideas you can come up with on your own. You might want to check with an adult and make sure that they're okay with you testing. So for this experiment, I think there are a lot of questions that you can investigate, and I've come up with a few here, but you can come up with your own as well. So what happens to the color when you mix an acid and a base? Does it matter how much pH indicator you use? If you test an acid, what happens to the color if you add neutral water to it? Does this tell you something about how the color relates to the strength of the acid? And what happens when you do the same thing with a base? Does the pH indicator work on solids or things that are dark in color? What do you think? So feel free to share your ideas in the chat if you have any. And also, if you have any questions about this experiment, let me know before we go on to the next experiment.
All right, Kathy, we have some questions. So
Okay.
one of them is where do you get purple cabbage, and can you use the green if you can't find purple?
Great question. So purple, excuse me, purple cabbage, I just buy at the regular grocery store in the produce section. And you cannot use green cabbage because the purple chemical in the cabbage is also made of chemicals, is what is the pH indicator. That's what's going to change color in the presence of an acid or a base. And green cabbage doesn't have that purple chemical in it, so that won't work.
Okay, and here's another one. So suppose you want to test the pH of a leaf, like a lettuce leaf. Can you just drop the indicator on the leaf?
That's another great question, and what I want to throw that back to you and have you try that yourself. So this is all about experimenting and learning through experimentation. So give it a try and see what you find out, and see if maybe you can try different ways. Does it make a difference if you chop it up or put it in water? Just experiment.
Okay, thanks. That's all we had.
Great. All right, I have one more experiment for you. So, have you ever made lemonade or Kool-Aid with a powder? Or have you used salad dressing where the oil floats on top? If you have, you already know something about solubility. The sugar in the drink powder dissolves in the water. The oil on top of the vinegar in your salad dressing does not dissolve in the vinegar. Lemonade is made of sugar, flavorings, and food coloring, all of which are chemicals that dissolve in water. So kind of like in your lemonade, water you find in nature like ponds, rivers, and lakes has chemicals that are dissolved in it. We would say that they are soluble. But there are also things in there that don't dissolve. They are insoluble. The reason that some chemicals are soluble and others are insoluble relates to the structure of the chemicals, how the different atoms are put together to make the chemical. Both the dissolved chemicals and the undissolved ones can have an effect on the plants and animals that live in the water. So take a look at this water that I collected from DuPage River. Right away, you can see that it's not clear like water from your kitchen sink. Most of what you see is undissolved silt floating around. In case you haven't heard the word silt before, it's the mud at the bottom of a river, some of which gets stirred up and ends up floating in the river. If I leave my jar of water sit for a day, much of that silt will fall to the bottom of the jar. Is that silt dissolved or undissolved? What do you think? Type your answer into the chat. Do you think it's dissolved or undissolved?
We have one answer so far.
Okay.
We have undissolved.
Right, undissolved. So that other word for that would be insoluble. So that's insoluble.
Yes, another one too says that.
Great, great. So you might need special kinds of scientific instruments to see what's dissolved in the water, but you can imagine that there are some chemicals in there that are actually good for the critters living in the river. So imagine a fish in the DuPage River constantly taking in water through its gills. You probably learned that's how fish get oxygen, which has the chemical formula of O2. We know that fish need oxygen to survive, so we can conclude with a lot of confidence that if there are living fish in the DuPage River, there must also be dissolved oxygen in the river water. There are also things dissolved in the DuPage River that are not so great for fish. This brings us around to the idea that not every chemical in nature is something that we want there. We call these chemicals pollution. An example of pollution that gets into the river and is not so healthy for the ecosystem there is fertilizer that you use on your lawn. When it rains, some of that fertilizer may be washed away and end up in the river. Can you think of types of pollution that might end up in the river but won't dissolve in it, that are insoluble? This might be something that you would see floating. So can you think of anything floating or insoluble that might be polluting the river?
All right, we're getting some answers. We've got soda cans, we have plastic, we have oil, used masks, tires.
My goodness, those are great. Yeah, those are all things that are probably not going to be healthy for our river ecosystem. On the other hand, my duck floating is probably good for our river. Okay, so let's do some experiments with solubility, figuring out what dissolves in our water. For this experiment, you'll need, again, some water that you get from nature, a pond, river, lake, snow, rainwater, paper towels or coffee filters, clear plastic or glass jars or cups, and other things that you can find from around your house, classroom, or nature to test their solubility. So, first, you'll investigate what is undissolved, insoluble in the water you collected. Can you see anything floating around in it or on top of it? What happens when you let the water sit for a while? Does anything fall to the bottom? Do you see living things swimming in your water? After you've had a good look, use a paper towel or coffee filter to remove those undissolved items from your water sample. What do you see in your water? What about on your filter? Try comparing water that you've collected from different locations, like a pond and a river. Is there a difference in what you see on your filter? Now you can experiment with your water to find out what dissolves in it, that is, what is soluble. Pour some of the water into separate cups for testing. Take anything you can find from around your house, classroom, or outdoors to try. Here are some ideas that I had. Oil, vinegar, snow or ice, soil, leaves, food coloring, sugar, salt, and pieces of a plastic bag. Again, I've come up with some ideas for questions that you can investigate while you're experimenting, but you can come up with some ideas of your own. So, is there a difference in the solubility between liquids and solids? Does it matter how much you add? Does stirring make things dissolve more? What happens if you wait and check back later? Has more dissolved? Does temperature make a difference? Think about when you tried to dissolve ice or snow. And what other questions can you answer? Once you've played around with dissolving things in your water, you can use your imagination to consider what happens when chemicals end up in nature that don't belong there, pollution. You may have tried cooking oil, but sometimes lakes and rivers get polluted with oil from trucks or cars. I know one of you put that in your chat already when I asked about insoluble pollutants. So you may have tried vinegar, which you learned in our first experiment is an acid. But sometimes industries release acid pollution into rivers. Do you think the pH of the river water would go up or down if it was polluted with an acid? Can you put that in your chat? So acid gets into the river, what's going to happen to the pH?
Oh, I'm starting to see down. We're getting several downs.
Wow, I'm impressed that you remember that because to me it seems backwards. The more acidic something is, the lower the number. So good job remembering that. All right. So any questions about that experiment?
Well, yes, we have a couple about that experiment and
Great.
then one from the previous one as well.
Oh, great.
So let's start with this experiment. How does oxygen dissolve in the water?
Oh, that's a great question. So oxygen is a gas and water is a liquid. And so gases actually can dissolve in liquids. And usually the colder the liquid is, the more gas that can dissolve. And as the liquid warms up, more of that gas is just going to go out into the air. So the oxygen that is dissolved in the water in a river, for example, would come from two things. It might come from just the air around it. Some of that oxygen is going to go into the water. And then also we know that when plants photosynthesize, they give off oxygen. So some, like if there's some kind of pondweed or something like that, that might give off oxygen, and that's going to be in that river water.
Okay, great. And here's a question about filtering. Can I drink the water from the river if it's poured through the paper towel first?
Oh, I would not advise that, because the paper towel is just going to take out some of the insoluble chemicals, but some of them are going to get through. And then there's also all those dissolved soluble chemicals that are not going to be removed by the paper. So some of those might not be so healthy for you. So no, you would not want to drink that.
All right. And here's another one. Is there a maximum amount of what can be dissolved in water, and what determines that?
Ah, interesting. So I think that this is another good question for you to investigate when you're doing your experimentation. But I think maybe you can get a clue from that if you've ever made lemonade from a powder. You probably know there's at some point where if you put too much of that sugar powder in there, it's not going to dissolve. So how soluble something is really is related again to that structure of the chemical. So that's how the different atoms in the chemical are put together.
Okay, and that's good. We have a question about the previous experiment.
Yeah.
Does the cabbage juice indicator correspond to a pH paper indicator?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so this way of testing pH is just one of many different ways. And the nice thing about it is you can just, go to the grocery store and buy cabbage and do your experiment. It doesn't require any special materials or supplies or anything like that. So that's why I really like this one. But if you happen to have a fish tank or something like that where you have pH paper, you can try that and see if you get the same answer. That would be a really interesting experiment. So I would encourage you to do that. And if you are interested in going further and learning more about pH, then you can order some pH paper online, or probably go to a pet shop where they sell fish. Or if you have a swimming pool too, you might have that.
So yeah, a follow-up question from another participant is, do the colors produced from the cabbage indicator match pH paper?
Are they the same colors? No, I don't believe that they are, because it's a different chemical indicator in the paper than it is from the cabbage. So it wouldn't be the same colors.
Okay, that's all we have right now.
Great. Thank you for all those great questions. I appreciate that. So just before we go, I wanted to tell you a little bit about chemistry and nature at Fermilab. Did you know that in addition to being America's particle physics and accelerator laboratory, Fermilab is a national environmental research park? So you can find lots of chemistry and nature here. Just to give one example, Each year, we burn part of the prairie to help improve the soil and to limit the growth of invasive species. Burning is actually a chemical reaction called combustion. Here's the combustion reaction of cellulose, which I mentioned a few minutes ago as the large chemical in the cell walls of plants. Cellulose plus oxygen produces carbon dioxide and water and fire. Sometimes combustion is not complete, so there are other new chemicals formed which are left behind in the soil or go up in the air as smoke. The ash that's left is mostly carbon and minerals that the plants use to help them grow. So thanks for watching, and I hope you try some of these experiments. This presentation is recorded, so if you need to go back and check any of the details of how to do the experiments, you can check the video. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those, and I really appreciate your attention today. And again, I hope you do the experiments.
Well, I don't see any more questions.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much again for coming. Happy Earth Day.